Confederate General Patrick Cleburne wanted to utilize slaves in the early part of the war, but was turned down by the Confederate Congress. Not until March of 1864 did President Jefferson Davis, along with Robert E. Lee, convince the Confederate Congress to officially muster in black troops. These troops would never see battle. Lee would surrender at Appomattox in April of 1865. No other event in our history has defined the American Constitution or our government than the American Civil War. With the American Revolution, we the people declared that all free-thinking men shall be self-governed. With the spirit of 1776, we give definition to a people who agreed to self-government. Out of the ashes of the American Civil War arose the encompassment of a strong, centered government. We now brought definition to our government, but not without a tremendous cost to our nation. Well over 600,000 Americans of North and South gave their last measure for the birth of this new nation.
Many slaves throughout the South felt an allegiance to their slave owners, particularly in the instance where they were not beaten every day. Many slaves came to accept slavery as their fate, as a way of life.
It is a factor that has been made up note of that very few Southerners actually owned slaves. Most Southerners did not.
People are doing what they have to do. They are sometimes doing what they want to do. And they are doing what they were forced to do. Many of those who are working in the Confederacy are slaves who were laborers. Many others who are in the Confederacy are there with their slaveholders who are also their relatives. Their Union Army may be very far away, and it will be completely out of the question for them to be able to safely escape to it.
So they lived a comparative in a comparative status. The slaves at the plantation down the road were beaten regularly and what have you. They were not adventuresome in many instances to the extent that they were willing to run away and face the unknowns of what was waiting for them 100 miles away or 50 miles away. And then family liaisons suggested that many slaves did not leave. But I think that there are numerous psychological studies taking place whereas individuals become to a certain extent dependent on their oppressors. And I would have to think that this was probably, not being a psychologist of course, but I would have to think that this is probably the motivation for forest slaves remaining both during the war and even after the war, as has been indicated by others, until their deaths.
Why do these men support the forces defending slavery? It seems today that the complexity of African American life in the Confederate and pre-Confederate South has been lost in the singular issue of slavery. But, in fact, slavery, while certainly dominated by the white race, was not their sole domain. Native Americans and African American freedmen also owned slaves. In the year preceding the war, in the city of Charleston, South Carolina alone, there existed no less than 120 black freedmen who owned at least one slave. Several black slave owners wrote jointly to the New Orleans Daily Delta in December 1860.
Many places throughout the Deep South, the older parts where the larger plantations existed, also witnessed the existence of blacks owning other blacks. A number of blacks who had been manumitted or had earned enough money to purchase their own freedom became entrepreneurs, purchased or acquired land, and in turn became slave owners and went into cotton, indigo, or rice farming.
Well, I think that most people, when they hear that there were blacks who fought in the Confederacy, they are outraged because they think that these fighters were forced to fight. In some instances they probably were. It's very hard for people today to accept the fact that a black could volunteer for Confederate service because he felt some kind of patriotism towards the South, that he felt loyalty towards a master, or that he wanted to prove to the establishment that he was deserving of eventually receiving his freedom. what many Americans forget is that there were 5,000 black soldiers who fought with George Washington during the Revolutionary War. And of course, in 1812, Andrew Jackson, who praised the blacks in his service profusely, also knew that those blacks were taking a risk fighting for the United States government. So if blacks can fight for George Washington, it's hard for me to reject the idea that their grandsons could not have fought for Robert E. Lee. And of course, remember, they had practical considerations. Many of them, they only knew the South. And many of the blacks who were in the Confederate forces, most of the blacks were more useful to the Confederate Army or to the Confederate government as civilians as opposed to being soldiers or sailors. Many of these blacks were taking the chance of saying, look, I'm going to show you that I'm a patriot, and I hope to be rewarded as a consequence of it. These are very practical considerations. I think the problem that we have today is most Americans have a difficult time accepting the past because we read into the past the prejudices of the present. The moment you do that, you're not dealing with history. I mean, history, I've often said to my students, is like taking a bath in muddy water. You're never going to be completely clean. And you have to see the past as the past was, not the way we wish it was.
Bodyguards of our masters served through the war between the states, and we have been to all the reunions and they have treated us just the same as any other soldier. I'm Marmaduke, Joe Shelby, bodyguard. Done everything they told me to do. So one day, General Marmaduke told me to go and get some chicken. I told him I didn't know what's going on. He said, I've got his gun, look like I'm red chaps on there. I told him, yes, sir, I'll go right now. Well, you want to know how old I am? I'll be 81 years old the first day in August. Dan Winter.
One of the most famous generals in the Confederate Army was Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest. He had 45 slaves whom he took from his plantation to serve with him during his command.
Probably one of the most elite units in the Confederate military was Nathan Bedford Forrest Cavalry, and specifically one of his units, his own escort company. These were essentially the Green Berets of the Confederate cavalry. They were handpicked, the best troops. They were put into this escort company, and when the fighting really got down to the wire, Forrest would put in his escort company to basically carry the day. Of these handpicked men, about 20% of them were black cavalrymen. That these were some of the bravest, some of the best shots, some of the just most fearsome men that the Confederate cavalry had, and these black and white troopers formed this elite group of Forrest escort.
Forrest was a major slave trader prior to the Civil War. His attitude towards black was one, at best, of paternalism. He viewed blacks as property. After the war, he viewed blacks as having a particular place in society.
And after Reconstruction was over, he actually worked through the Democratic Party to bring black voters in this area into the fold of the Democratic Party. So if anything, he was a man of his times in this area of the country.
My great-grandfather, as a Union soldier here on April 12, 1864, faced black Confederate soldiers under the direction of General Nathan Bedford Forrest. He was also wounded here, and I don't know whether he was wounded by a black Confederate soldier or a white Confederate soldier, but I know he was wounded and he was captured here, and from April 12, 1864 until October the 31st, 1865, that is when he returned back to his unit.
I think fundamentally, Forrest was a pragmatist. While slavery was a legal institution, he was willing to use the system and benefit from the system. When the war was over, he recognized slavery was through, that it was never coming back, and he went about trying to rebuild his fortune. Forrest addressed some of the black citizens of Memphis after the war and told them that the war was over and that he would advise them to do the same thing that he advised the men who fought with him, and that was to become good citizens and to vote. He said, "I will not tell you how to vote, but vote." He was a pragmatist. People don't realize that, and too infrequently give him that credit when it comes to issues particularly involving slavery.
They say he was good to his slaves for one reason. The old dollar sign. That way he get more for them, you see, and get more out of them on his plantations. Well, that's half truth too. I mean, he was good to his slaves, but he was also good to them because he was a humanitarian.
On a large plantation such as Forrest ran, about the only records you get are things that deal with how much food was issued or what kind of work is expected. And the sorts of things that deal with person-to-person relationships are very hard to come by. The one thing that I can tell you from historically valid point is that at the beginning of the war, when Forrest raised his own regiment, he recruited 42 of his own slaves and said, "Drive wagons for me, drive ambulances for me. At the end of the war, if the Union wins, you'll be free. If the Confederacy wins, I will set you free." During the course of the war, one deserted, the other 41 were with Forrest at the end of the war. I suppose that tells you something about the force of his personality. It does not necessarily directly answer your question, but it certainly tells you that he was a man that was able to win the allegiance of people.
I said to 45 colored fellows on my plantation that they would go with me. If we got whipped, they would be free anyhow. And if we succeeded, they would act faithfully with me to the end of the war. I would set them free. 18 months before the war closed, I was satisfied that we were going to be defeated. And I gave those 45 of them their free papers for fear I might be called. General Nathan Bedford Forrest, 1865.
After the war, 20 of the 45 former slaves went home with Forrest, including his longtime valet, Jerry, whom the other body servants nicknamed the General, seeing that he was in charge of them all. Another body servant who served in Forrest's army was Wright Whitlow from Kentucky. Wright was by Forrest's side when he attacked Fort Pillow on April 12, 1864.
I witnessed the Battle of Fort Pillow, and at one time during the battle, I held the horse of General Forrest while he mounted a new one after the first one was shot out from under him. Wright Whitlow, bodyguard, General Forrest, Confederate Cavalry.
One of the most famous accounts of a close master-body-servant relationship was that of Andrew Martin Chandler and his servant, Silas. At 15, Chandler joined the Confederate service and was put in Company F of the 44th Mississippi Infantry. His 17-year-old former slave accompanied him. Silas Chandler received his manumission before the war began, yet he chose to stay with his friend and follow him off to war.
My name is Bobby Chandler. I'm the great-grandson of Silas Chandler from West Point, Mississippi, which is my home. Silas Chandler lived in West Point as a slave belonging to the Chandler family. Silas was a slave of Andrew Chandler's father. Andrew Chandler and Silas grew up to be very good friends. Andrew went to the Civil War, and Silas went with them, probably as a body soldier. But to my understanding, he fought with him side by side, which was something unusual for slaves in the Civil War.
That kind of devotion, duty, loyalty, whatever you call it, was hardly narrow. I mean, what many people fail to realize is that before the Civil War, there were over 500,000 free blacks scattered throughout the South, 60,000 of them in the state of Virginia alone. And many of these people their roots go back generations and generations, and there were strong ties there. That human beings, being what we are, these complicated species, you could not rupture those relationships simply because of the differences in color.
There is evidence that blacks fought for their masters in their mode as body servants. But again, that's very distinct from being officially recognized as soldiers, as being armed as soldiers. Grabbing a weapon, whether it's a rifle or a knife or a shovel when the enemy is advancing directly on you, is a different thing from being issued a weapon, issued ammunition, and being given orders to fight as an integrated combat unit. In that sense, blacks did not fight for the Confederacy.
They were a very elite group in the South. This is something that their status, and this is what they were trained to do, this was their identity. And to go to something unknown, for some promise that may not be a promise at all, instead of what they knew, and they had a life that was very good for them, a life that was very good, especially compared with other people who were enslaved. I think it is a very, very natural thing for people who were that close to the masters to stay with them.
So-called body servants that went off with their masters to war were slaves who accompanied a slave owner to the battle, and they would serve as cook and valet and this kind of thing. But that's another myth, because most Confederate soldiers did not own slaves. They estimate that 9 out of 10 men that fought in the Confederate Army never owned a slave. So it was only the upper class and the few that had the affluence to bring a body servant with him to the war. Many of the blacks that served with Confederate armies were there because they were recruited to be wagon drivers or cooks or whatever, not because they came off with a master.
Silas saved Andrew's life. Andrew got wounded in the Battle of Chickamauga, I think it's called, in Georgia. And they wanted to take Andrew's leg. Silas didn't want them to amputate his leg, so he stole him away from the camp and took him back home to Mississippi by hitching a freight train and hiking on a freight train with him.